Welcome to Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and joining me on this show is Congressman Tom McClintock, who represents California's 4th District. Welcome.
Thank you, Joel.
Pleasure to have you on. We have quite a few very interesting issues to talk about today, so let's get right into it. We live in Calaveras County, which is a source county for quite a bit of water that comes off the Sierra Nevada and then is used all throughout the state, really. But we are in a drought right now, and there are many decisions being made about how to use the water that we do have, but also planning for the future and getting ready to be ready for droughts that may continue. I think this drought's been about 3 or 4 years now, but we could be in quite a stretch of drought years here. So I was hoping you could kind of overview the situation of water in California for our viewers and talk a little bit about what's going on in the state right now.
Well, droughts are nature's fault. They happen. But water shortages are our fault. Mother Nature produces about 45,000 gallons a day of fresh water for every man, woman, and child on this planet. The problem is that water is unevenly distributed over both time and distance. We build dams to transport water from wet years to dry years. We build canals to transfer water from wet areas to dry areas. We don't build these facilities to more efficiently dump that water into the Pacific Ocean. Water tends to get there very well on its own. Now, the basic problem in California is this. We have not built a major reservoir in this state since 1979. That was the New Melones, and in the meantime, the population has nearly doubled. Everybody thinks the Colorado River is the mother lode of all water in the western United States. The Colorado River is actually a junior sister to the Sacramento. Sacramento's bigger. The difference is we store 70 million acre-feet on the Colorado and only 10 million acre-feet on the Sacramento. Most of the rest is flushed into the Pacific Ocean. So that's the basic problem. We've got to build more water facilities. The good news is we've got 2 unfinished dams right here in California. Shasta Dam was built to 600 feet elevation, but it was designed for 800 feet. We built it to 600 because that's all we needed at the time, but it was deliberately designed for an 800-foot elevation. Adding that extra 200 feet, which would cost about $6.5 billion, would almost double our storage. It would add another 9 million acre-feet of storage to the Sacramento system. The Auburn Dam, just upstream from Folsom, that was half completed in the 1970s and then abandoned. Completing that dam would add enough water to fill and refill Folsom Lake nearly 2.5 times. And, by the way, provide about 800 megawatts of the cleanest, cheapest electricity we're capable of producing. But unfortunately, layer after layer of extreme environmental regulations have blocked the completion of these dams and the construction of any new dams in California for a generation. And now we're dealing with the result. At the very least right now, and again, understanding that we are not going to solve our water problems until we start building more dams, and we're not going to be able to build more dams until we have reformed these extremist environmental laws, we at least ought to be taking good care of the water that remains. And yet, just in the past month, the Bureau of Reclamation has released 70,000 acre-feet of water on the Stanislaus and American rivers in order to satisfy environmental regulations that place fish above people. Now, 70,000 acre-feet of water is enough to meet the annual needs of a city with a population of 500,000. That's what was released out of our dams of desperately needed water, knowing we're going into a catastrophic summer. All for the amusement of the fish. The stated reasons were they wanted to nudge the salmon smolts to swim to the ocean. Well, they tend to swim there anyway without our assistance. And they wanted to get the temperature just right in the rivers. Bear in mind, if we didn't have the dams, all the rivers would be absolutely dry and there wouldn't be any fish. So these regulations are ridiculous, and they're doing enormous harm. How do we demand that our people scrimp and save and stretch and ration every drop of water while the government is treating the water so recklessly and so frivolously? I mean, in many communities, if you're caught with a 1-gallon puddle on your lawn on the wrong day, you can be facing stiff fines, and worse than fines, a lecture. And yet the government thinks nothing of flushing 23 billion gallons of water out to the ocean for the amusement of the fish. government loses its moral authority and its credibility in making these demands when its conduct is so reckless and so irresponsible and so wasteful.
What is kind of the breakdown of who uses water in California when it comes to agricultural use versus customers, water customers?
Well, again, most of it goes out to the ocean for environmental purposes. I don't remember the exact numbers. Agriculture uses a significant portion of that, but don't forget, that's water that's not used for agriculture, is used for you and me. The cheeseburger that you're going to have for lunch today, perhaps, that means 700 gallons. 700 gallons of water was required to grow the stuff that is in the single cheeseburger that you'll be ordering for lunch. You go to the store and buy a pair of blue jeans. 1,100 gallons of water was necessary to grow the cotton to make those blue jeans. So when we say agricultural water, that's water that's converted into the stuff that you and I use every day and depend upon for the quality of our lives.
So, but the breakdown is a huge amount of water goes to agriculture compared to actual going to the use of people for everyday lives. And yet you're saying that the people are the ones who are asked to conserve more. How do you feel about...
Well, agriculture has been cut off. I mean, look at what's happening in the Central Valley. Some farmers have been notified that they are going to be getting 0 allocations from the federal system this year. At most, they're getting about 5% of allocations from the state water system. And that's it. We have lost 500,000 acres of the most fertile farmland in America to these restrictions, and yet the government has no problems flushing 70,000 acre-feet to keep the temperature just right so the fish don't get cranky.
What do you think the impact of this farmland going out of production and farmers getting 0 allocation will have on the state and the nation?
Well, obviously, you've got huge unemployment. You have the spectacle of food lines in communities that once prided themselves on being the breadbasket of California, in fact, the breadbasket of the world. The worst thing, though, is that is going to ripple throughout the rest of the economy. And again, at a time when we have squandered so much of our water and failed to build the facilities necessary to assure that we have abundant water even in dry years.
What have been the main impediments to building these new dams?
Environmental extremism. It is just that simple. We had a hearing in Fresno with the House Natural Resources Committee about 6 weeks ago, and the one thing that came through loud and clear is we're not going to fix our water problems until we build more dams, and we can't build more dams until there's been fundamental reform of extremist environmental legislation that's now being used to block the construction of any new facility.
Do you believe that there would be some gain in focusing more on conservation, desalinization, and perhaps better agriculture practices where you're using less water instead of building new dams?
Agriculture is already using state-of-the-art conservation measures, and in fact, there are teams from Israel that come to the Central Valley of California to study their computer-assisted below-ground irrigation. They have invested millions of dollars. They're already doing that. We are confusing, though, conservation with adding increased supply. Conservation is an essential tool to manage a shortage in a drought emergency, but instead we've been using it as a substitute for adding new water facilities. And the result is this. Now when we hit a real drought, we've already stretched our conservation measures to the utmost. We don't have that flexibility any longer. The underlying problem is chronic shortage of storage capacity, and that gets right back to that simple question: we've got to build more dams.
Do you think that it is the right thing to do to use every last drop of this water for agriculture or providing to cities, or is there some point where we've just reached the population that this state can really handle and we need to just stop continuing to expand?
Well, again, you look at the Colorado River where they have less water on the Colorado system than we have on the Sacramento. They store 70 million acre-feet on the Colorado. We store 10 million acre-feet on the Sacramento. The good news is there is no shortage of available sites. There is no shortage of affordable projects. The only thing we lack is the political will to move forward with them. And at 45,000 gallons of water per day per person that nature produces, there is no water shortage. It's a distribution shortage. That's why we build dams and aqueducts.
Do you think that this drought is an opportunity to get the ball rolling on starting to build new facilities?
Well, we've always had that opportunity. The problem is we haven't taken it. Maybe it's a wake-up call. You remember what Dr. Johnson said, when a man is to be hanged in the morning, it concentrates his attention remarkably. I'm sensing that, everywhere I go, people are saying, what do you mean we haven't built a new dam in 30 years? Well, we haven't. And they are incredulous to realize that our water policy has been that idiotic. By the way, you mentioned desalination, which I hear quite often. Why don't we just do more desalination? Well, that's a great idea if you don't mind paying triple for your water. Desalination has an important role to play in very arid areas. Israel uses it extensively. Desert islands in the Caribbean, like Aruba, depend upon distilled desalinated water. Fortunate, and it's extremely expensive. It is very, very meticulously rationed. The good news is we don't live in an arid area. We live in one of the most water-rich regions of the world. All we have to do is store that water at a fraction of the cost of desalination.
And there's a huge desal plant going in San Diego right now, I believe, which is going to provide quite a bit of water. But they're also looking into some toilet-to-tap programs. And I was wondering, what's your feeling on using reclaimed water to go back into the, let's say, the groundwater storage, and then bringing that back up and treating it? And
if it pencils out cheaper than above-ground storage, I'm all for it. The problem is it doesn't pencil out. It's extremely expensive. You mentioned the desal plant in San Diego. That's being heavily subsidized by ratepayers. I mean, if you want to know why your water rates are going through the roof, it's because part of your rates are being used to subsidize projects like that couldn't possibly compete if accurate price signals were reaching consumers.
Coming back to Calaveras County and our situation with water, we have more water than we could really ever use because we're a source county. Most of it goes by and goes to other people. Do you think that small counties like us should still go full bore into conservation programs to save water for the greater good of the state?
No, look, we have laws on water rights that have evolved over 150 years. And one of the central tenets is that areas of origin have first right to the water. And that's as it should be. Surplus water ought to be available to other areas. But the areas of origin ought to have first right to that water. And that's another disturbing development that we're seeing through the State Water Resources Control Board that is now asserting essentially authority to override 150 years of property rights laws when it comes to water.
Yeah, and that's something that we're concerned about, is that we do have these rights. We're not using all of them. The state's looking to take those rights away from us. Do you believe in, if you're not using it, you lose it, or do you believe in planning for the future of small counties and keeping those rights?
I believe in protecting areas of origin. Those areas that are closest to the water have first call on that water. That's the difference between living in a wet region and living in a dry region. That doesn't mean that we begrudge surplus water being used for other communities in dry areas. But the problem is the water is being taken from the areas of origin as well as from the drier areas and being flushed into the ocean because of these extremist environmental regulations. That's the root of the problem. And until that's dealt with, our water problems are going to become more and more severe as the years go by.
What are your thoughts on climate change?
Climate's been changing for the last 4 billion years, and whether or not we impose draconian restrictions on our economy and wreck it, I can guarantee you that the climate will continue to change. The Earth will continue to warm and cool as it has for 4 billion years.
Do you think that man is contributing to the change in temperature?
No, I do not. And I think that there's ample evidence that it is not. The most important evidence being the planet has been warming since the last ice age, on and off, but there are periods just within our own recorded human history when the planet has been warmer than it is today, and other periods when it's been much colder than it is today. There is one constant, and that is that the planet warms and cools, and it's been doing so a long time before your SUV. A couple of inconvenient questions to these climate alarmists. If your SUV is causing global warming, why is it that we have ample records of a medieval warm period when the planet was so warm they were growing wine grapes in northern Britain, and there was a thriving agricultural economy in Greenland? If your SUV is causing global warming, why is it that we're seeing the same phenomenon on every other body in the solar system? I mean, if you doubt that for a second, just Google Mars warming or Pluto warming or whatever your favorite planet or former planet is, and you'll see reams of scholarly observations on these subjects. This is alarmism in the extreme. We were told 15 years ago that the planet would be warming catastrophically over these past 15 years. Instead, all of the data says the climate has stabilized over the past 15 years.
Regardless of the cause, we do have a peculiar weather pattern which has caused a drought in this state. We've talked about the water repercussions.
Yeah, but we talk as though this is the first time there's ever been a drought in California, and that's ludicrous. It goes back to Ogden Nash's little ditty. He said, the ass was born in March, the rains came in November. Such a flood as this, he said, I scarcely can remember. You go back just through our recent history, you will see periods where the planet's been much warmer than it is, much colder than it is, and you'll see periods when this state has been plagued by severe droughts, and also periods when it's been plagued by severe floods. It happens. The question is, are we going to build the facilities necessary to store water in wet years so that we can use it in dry years? And bear in mind that prior to the dams being constructed, in a drought, the rivers simply dried up and all the fish died. In a flood period, sensitive riparian habitats were completely blown away by huge floods. There is nothing more devastating to riparian habitat than a flood or a drought. It was the dams that tamed that cycle and provided a more moderated and continuing source of water, not only for the riparian habitats, but again, as I said, we build these facilities for the people, and we ought to be using them for the people.
As I was saying, regardless of the cause of this drought, we are in the drought. You've gone over the water side of things, but I was hoping you would also tell us about fire, because that's a huge concern for us in the foothills here. We had the Rim Fire last year, which was absolutely devastating just to the south of us. We had late rains in the spring, and the grasses are very high, and the brush is very dry as well. CAL FIRE says this could be an absolutely catastrophic year. I'm curious to know, one, if you'll take us back to the Rim Fire and look at the causes, how it was handled, and how the aftermath worked out. And then if you would finish by talking about what we can do this year to prepare for another bad fire season.
Well, first of all, you've got to take a look at the last 30 years of history. Again, we get right back to extremist environmental regulations that have choked off the harvesting of excess timber out of our forests. There's been an 80% decline in timber harvests on federal lands in the past 30 years. Meanwhile, there's been a concurrent and concomitant increase in acreage destroyed by fires. If you chart those two data sets on a chart, it looks like an X. The descending part of that X is the timber harvest. The ascending part, which is coordinated, I mean, just almost on a one-to-one basis, is acreage destroyed by fire. It's been often said that excess timber comes out of the forest one way or the other. It is either carried out or it is burned out, but it does come out. When we carried that excess timber out, we had thriving forests, and we had a healthy and thriving and vibrant economy. Since the environmental left has taken over these policies and consigned our forests to a state of benign neglect, they have become grossly overgrown, which makes them susceptible to infestations of pestilence and disease and catastrophic forest fires. We've seen a dramatic increase in those fires in recent years in direct correlation with the decline in the timber harvest. We've got now, and bear this in mind, that timber is owned by the American people. When we used to auction off the surplus of that timber that meant huge amounts of money coming into the national treasury that we could then use to better manage the forests. When they cut off the timber harvest, they cut off that stream of revenue to the American people, as well as the huge stream of revenue created by all the economic activity for the regions in the Sierra. Another reason we had fewer fires in those days is because you had small harvesting crews distributed throughout the Sierra Nevada. You had well-maintained timber roads to move equipment. And so when a crew saw a fire starting on the next ridge, it took little time and trouble to get their equipment over there, put out that fire, and then get back to work. Those crews are all gone now, which means that fires will burn for days before they're even addressed.
Well, clearly there's a very strong group of people who don't want to get logging going the way it used to be. So how can you, as a politician, find some sort of a compromise where we could start managing our forests better?
Well, the first thing is to address the fire-killed timber. We have 400 square miles killed by the rim fire. That timber can still be used, but only for a very limited period of time. It loses much of its value after a year. After 2 years, it's totally worthless. So if we were able to auction off that already dead timber right after the fire, we could have been bringing in huge amounts of revenue. Unfortunately, the environmental regulations have become so cumbersome that it will take a full year after that fire for the timber even to be cleared for harvesting. But then you have litigation that is routinely filed on these projects that then runs out the clock completely. Now, there's 16,000 acres in the Rim Fire area owned privately by Sierra Pacific. They are not hamstrung by those regulations. They went in right after the fire and began salvaging. They will have that acreage completely salvaged within the next several months, and a small portion of what they are able to make off of that salvage work, they will then put back into those 16,000 acres to be sure that they're cleared of brush and that they have new healthy saplings. So within a couple of years, the 16,000 acres of privately owned land will be a green, thriving, new forest. The rest of the land managed by the public is going to be taken over by brush. After a couple of years, that timber, which has not been harvested out of the forest, will begin falling on top of that dry brush. Now you've got a perfect fire stack for second-generation fires, not to mention a huge beetle infestation as the beetle population literally explodes as a result of all of that dead timber to feast on. I authored legislation to expedite the salvage of the dead timber off of the public lands. It passed the House of Representatives several months ago, and it's been sitting since then dead in the Senate. And that's so frustrating.
So some people say that after a fire goes through, leaving those dead trees provides good habitat for a whole wide variety of animals. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, what happens is brush takes over that land. Those dead trees then begin toppling on that dead brush. You've got dry brush, dry logs, and a perfect fire stack when a lightning strike hits. That's why the second-generation fires are so absolutely devastating. And they will be particularly devastating to all the little critters that have taken up residence there in the meantime.
What can you do specifically to prevent the rim fire from happening somewhere else?
Well, again, we've got to start harvesting the excess timber out of our forests.
What's the status on that?
You either carry it out or you watch it being burned out. And the status is we've been trying, but again, we have huge opposition from environmental extremist groups. The Sierra Club is opposing any harvesting of dead timber in the Rim Fire area. Their position is simply let Mother Nature take care of it in its own time. And they're correct that ultimately the forest will grow back, but it won't grow back in my lifetime or your lifetime or our kids' lifetimes. And again, the management of the public lands, I think, is going to be measured by the management of the private lands, which in just a couple of years, as I said, will have green, growing, thriving, new young forest. And if you'll look at the public lands, there'll be dried brush and dead timber being feasted on by beetles and just waiting for a lightning strike for another catastrophic fire.
One thing that we're dealing with in Calaveras is that we have a really poor economy right now, and we're having trouble finding new jobs. And it seems as though if there was some way to find a compromise and in forests that haven't burned, go in there and do some maintenance, maybe not clear cutting, but at least selective logging, maybe a public-private partnership. Would you support something like that to create some jobs in this area?
This is what I've been pushing for the past 6 years on the House Natural Resources Committee. I fought to get on the Natural Resources Committee and on the subcommittee on public lands for exactly that reason. But the problem is, as long as environmental extremism dominates the policymakers, particularly in the Senate, we're not going to be able to make that progress. You know, that comes down to a question of political will, and the American people are going to have to look at this just lousy management of our public lands and come to the conclusion that, you know, that these are our lands. These were set aside in the case of the National Forest System by Gifford Pinchot, whose maxim was greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. That means sustainable management of these resources, but also the use and enjoyment of these resources by the American people. Preserving these lands for future generations does not mean closing it to this generation, and yet unfortunately that is the position of this administration, that is the position of the majority of the Senate. I don't think that is the position of the American people, and I think as they awaken to the lunacy that has guided these policies, that has produced a period of increasingly ferocious and frequent forest fires, that has created conditions where one of the most water-rich regions of the country is laid prostrate by drought. I think as they begin to realize the reason their electricity bills are skyrocketing, the reason their water bills are skyrocketing is because of these policies. I think we're going to see some big changes.
In the 2 minutes we have left, what are some strategies that a small rural county can employ to get out of a bad economic period?
Well, I think that the sheriffs in many of the counties that are now standing up to the, for example, the road closures that are being imposed on them by the Forest Service, I think that that's an important first step. You know, I was up in Alpine County the other day. 96% of Alpine County is owned by the federal government. That is a complete lack of balance. When you consider the fact that Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, federal government only owns 25% of the land area of Washington, D.C., yet it owns 96% of Alpine County. It owns 42% of California as a whole. There is a severe imbalance there, and you know, we've got to restore that balance and then restore the local control over these resources. You know, local communities are the most jealous guardians of the quality of life in those communities. Why have we taken so much of that control away from them as we've taken their land away from them?
Congressman, as always, I appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk about these issues. There are so many more things that I hope we can get to, but I hope you come back and visit us again.
Anytime, just give a holler.
Thank you. And thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and I hope you join me next time.